Hello, American history. Hope you're doing well. We are in World War One. America has joined the fight in Europe. You have Germany fight primarily against Britain in Europe, and now America is coming to join the Allied powers of Britain and France. We talked about last week of how America joined and why they joined. Germany had bombed the Lucenta that had American people on it, the British ship, and they just kept bombing American ships that were traveling to Europe. They got Mexico. They tried to get Mexico involved in fighting America, and so America had no choice really but to join World War One. They had gotten together weapons, gotten together men and soldiers ready to fight and getting ready to train. And so America was united together to fight in World War One. Before we continue talking about the fight in World War One, there was one other thing that happened during this time, and it really recognizes and relates to what we're going through right now in 2020, and that is the flu, influenza. Influenza was prevalent during this time in 1918. Influenza is, the flu H1N1, and it broke out in America in March of 1918 at Camp Funston, which is a military camp in Kansas. The cook there at the military camp was getting very sick. He had a very high fever. Now, the cook obviously is the one preparing the food and making the food, and who all is eating the food? The soldiers. Well, within days, 522 soldiers were reportedly sick, and by the end of the month, 1,100 of them were admitted to the hospital with the flu. So what is the flu? Little things about it. Maybe you've had it before, maybe you haven't. But it is a viral respiratory infection that causes symptoms similar to, but more severe than the common cold. Some symptoms include fever, cough, stuffy nose, and really just not feeling well, really feeling weak. I had the flu a year ago, as far as in 2019, the spring of 2019, or I guess you could say winter, and that is one of the worst things. You feel so weak, you feel like you've been working real hard, or just working out so much, or just doing so much, and you haven't really done anything. The body is just taking over your body. Just feel so weak and just terrible. So it is an awful virus to get. That was the first time I've ever gotten, or only time I've gotten it. So, but it is called H1N1, or is referred to that as well. And the reason is that it has antigens, which are proteins, on the virus's surface. One is called hemagglutinin, which has 18 subtypes, and neuraminidase, which has 11 subtypes. And so H1N1 is, the H, one of those 18 types, number one of that 18 subtypes, and then for the N, it's one of the 11 subtypes, and that's where you get H1N1. It was referred to as the Spanish flu, but no one knows where it really originated from. So we have this deadly virus, or it's about to be deadly in America, and these soldiers are going to Europe, and they're taking it with them. They're carriers of this, and they would spread the flu all across Europe during World War One, resulting in a pandemic just as we have today with coronavirus. Now, it was primarily in Europe, but it would eventually spread throughout the whole world. The first cases in Europe were not too bad. It was just a fever and an illness for 2 days. But then the flu grew stronger and it infected around 500 million people in 1918 during World War I. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses that were treating the virus would get the virus themselves. Like I said, we're talking about a century ago where they didn't have the technology and the education and knowledge that we have today. And so the way they were treating it and the way they were going about how to prevent it is not how we are today. The peak hit in November 1918, and then it suddenly dropped off in the winter. In Europe, not much was done to prevent the spreading of the disease. That they eventually would later in November, have limited number of people in a certain place, but that wasn't until November. In America, people were being educated about the disease, and the gauze mask was invented. So you see today, people wearing masks. Well, the gauze mask was invented during this time, and that's where we first see it when influenza hit in 1918. And so they made that mask to cover the mouth, the nose, and chin. And some cities made it a law that whenever people went out in public, you had to wear that mask. It was, of course, for the safety of the individual and the safety of everyone else. And so, like I said, this was a new thing, and people were not educated on it. They didn't know what it was, what really all was happening, and where it was going. And so they did not have the technology we have. They didn't have the information, knowledge that we have. And so they did not quarantine. They did have, America did have the face mask, and it would later, other people would adopt that as well. But other than that, there was no quarantine or, limited number of people, things. They just wore the mask. And so several million people died. In fact, 50 million people died from the flu in 1918. An interesting fact, more U.S. soldiers died from the flu than in battle. Now, how about that? They're about to go fight with guns and bombs and weapons, and an illness killed more of them than it was safer to go into the battle. So that's pretty crazy that, hey, I'd rather go fight in a war than, be, subject to a disease. So, but it was just the time of how nobody knew what was really going on. Where now we have more ways of trying to prevent the disease of corona, and we still are, researching of how to treat and everything, but we have more technology and more resources of how to treat things and preventing things and how to, recover from such a disease. And so the times have definitely changed since a century ago. Well, now America, like we said, has joined the war, and now they are about to fight. In World War I, the U.S. Army was referred to as the American Expeditionary Force. The commander was General John Pershing. He was a great general that led the army all throughout Europe. The first American troops were called doughboys, and they arrived in Europe in the fall of 1917. By the time America had joined the war, Germany had managed to get Russia out of the fight. The Germans helped Vladimir Lenin, who was a military leader for Russia, helped him to get back to Russia, where he would become the next leader of Russia, and he would end the fight for Russia in the winter of 1917. So Russia's out of the picture. And Germany is very glad about that. So now they just have to continue finishing off France and Britain. In the summer of 1918, Germany was winning against Britain and France. They were just dominating them and just getting victory after victory. But America, they would have to deal with America. The American forces joined along with the French soldiers, and they launched a counteroffensive and pushed the Germans back. America would keep Germany from getting to Paris. That's a big deal because Paris is a huge city for France. And so if Germany got there, that would be, a huge victory for them, but they would not get there. In August, Germany had huge losses to the American army, so America has made a huge impact for Britain and France and the Allied powers. At Saint Mihiel in France, American and French soldiers heavily defeated Germany using planes and on the ground they used guns and other weapons. The battle was over in 48 hours. America continued to defeat German forces, and the last main battle was in October, and it would end in November. On November 11th, the battle stopped. Germans knew that they would not win, and so they signed an armistice or an agreement to stop fighting. November 11th became known as Armistice Day, an American holiday, and we know it now as Veterans Day. They would later change the name to Veterans Day after World War II and the Korean War, and it's to honor veterans and remember how they fought for our country, and so we recognize them and pay honor to them on November 11th. World War I had taken the lives of 8 million people, and America hoped that this would be the war to end all wars. They hoped that as a result, after this, nations could be live peaceably. Maybe they still would have problems, but they could, deal with them peaceably. Woodrow Wilson, before the war ended, proposed a set of guidelines to help rebuild European peace. His guidelines were known as Wilson's 14 points. His main point was the League of Nations. The purpose of the League of Nations was to bring countries together to solve conflicts and problems peaceably, so there would be no need for war. So it's like you have a group of nations and they talk over about, so it's like even if you had two nations that were against each other, you would have the other nation saying, well, this is how you can solve this. You don't necessarily have to go to war. On June 28, 1919, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, and the treaty put the blame on Germany. It forced Germany to pay for its actions, and it had to give up land and resources to surrounding countries. Woodrow Wilson was not in favor of this, but he was outvoted by other leaders of other countries such as Britain and Italy and France. When Wilson returned to the U.S., he met with the Senate, who refused to the terms of the treaty. They did not want to join the League of Nations. They didn't want to be told when they could fight and where they could fight and different things like that. They did not want to be held down. They wanted to be able to say, well, if we want to join this war, we can join this war. If we don't want to join this war, we don't have to. And so the Senate did not agree with that. They did not want to be a part of the League of Nations, which, was against really what Wilson had wanted. So they did not see eye to eye. They did not agree. And as time passed, the U.S. really just said the war was over. They didn't really sign anything. They just said the war is over. And so, at the end of this war, a new decade was approaching. A new decade for America, the 1920s. Next week we will talk about how all the things that came with the 1920s and how America was different than in the previous decade. For this week's assignments, one assignment is I want you to write about one paragraph, 5 sentences. Write about if you were a person when influenza hit about 100 years ago. Write about just as we are in our own pandemic, write about if you were in the pandemic during World War I of influenza. Think about it. There's not quarantine. There's people dying. No one knows what's going on. Disease is just rapid. There's fever. It's the flu that we have today, but just people didn't know what was going on. There was no vaccine. So write 5 sentences about what it was like to live with influenza. And also remember the war is going on too. So you have both of these things. But write about if you were a person that was experiencing influenza during World War I and during 1918. 5 sentences. Just tell about what it would be like. What you think it would be like if you were one of those people. Then I want you to write another paragraph, 5 sentences, about why it was important for America that they had won and had victory in World War I. What did that do for them? Why was it important that they won? What if Germany had won? What would have happened? And so write 5 sentences why it was important that America won. Why was it important for them? Why was it important really for the world as well? And, just the impact that had. So writing 2 paragraphs, 1 paragraph, 5 sentences, or they're each 5 sentences. 1 paragraph's about if you were living during the time of influenza, writing about an experience of that, what it was like. And then the other paragraph is why is it important that America won World War I? What did it do for them? What did it do for the world? What would have happened if Germany had won? And so that is what your assignments are for this week. Hope you have a good week and enjoy the weather. We are starting to have good spring weather, and I hope you have a good week.